This is a round shader, and tattooing with a round shader can be quite difficult, and it's certainly a lot more difficult than tattooing with a mag. I know for me it was, and it did actually take me quite a while to find the correct setup and the correct technique. You see, I was always using a round shader, but I couldn't quite get it. Every time I used a round shader, I just couldn't get it smooth, I couldn't get it consistent, and it was just putting in pigment way too fast. So if that sounds familiar, stick around, because hopefully this video is going to help. Also, make sure you do stay till the end for the demonstration. A round shader is a configuration of needles similar to a liner, but the needles aren't soldered so tightly compact. So because of this, the round shader is a lot less traumatic on skin than what your traditional liner would be. And I would say this is the #1 reason to why an artist would choose a round shader over a liner to do all their lining aspects of a tattoo. The round shader is a do-all, jack-of-all-trades needle. Lining, check. Shading, check. Tightening areas, check. Getting into small gaps, check. Texture, check. The round shader does it all. When it comes to round shaders, the type of round shader that you pick will depend on the job that you need it for. If you are wanting your round shaders to line, you may want to stay away from 12 gauge and stick to that 10 or even 8 gauge. That way, even though a round shader isn't as tightly compact, having that 10 gauge or 8 gauge is still going to bring it more in line with a liner needle. But it isn't just about 8 gauge and 10 gauge needles, you also need to take into account the taper depending on how you want your line to look. Now, using a round shader to line is a lot more forgiving than it would be if you was to use an actual lining needle. Because of that spread, you will find that it's harder to achieve a blowout, and it will also reduce any shake in your line. That is not to say that you cannot blow out with a round shader, because you certainly can. Now, you also need to be aware that if you was to use a round shader as a liner, it is going to produce a softer line than an actual lining needle would. Now, this isn't something that your client is going to notice, but if you are looking for it, you can definitely tell the difference between a regular lined line with a liner and a line with a round shader. So that's lining, but what happens if you are wanting your round shaders to shade? Well, using a tighter round shader isn't going to help. However, that is very specific to the piece that you have. But generally, the more spread your round shader is, the bigger in size that your round shader is, the easier time that you will have creating a smooth blend with a round shader. And the less compact they are, you have more surface area when tattooing. This leads to an easier, more consistent process when it comes to getting your smooth shades. So if you are new to round shaders, be careful on the round shader that you pick. My personal preference for a round shader would be a 10 gauge 9. I found that this is easier to get into the small gaps, to create texture, but also to fill in and get smoother, larger areas. Now, you will have to assess what is the best round shader for you, depending on your style of tattooing and depending on the reference you are using, but just take that into account. Now, when it comes to your machine, if you are a beginner using round shaders, I would always go for a machine that has give, especially if you find it difficult to work from the tips of your needle. I would also go with a softer hitting machine. In my case, if I'm using the Bishop Wand Packer, I would switch to the Bishop Wand Shader. Overall, a softer machine will help, whether that comes through the machine and the motor or the give. Being soft is king, and it's simply because of the formation of needles being more tightly compact. Yes, a round shader isn't as compact as a liner, but it is still compact. And because of that compactness, it is so easy to overdo it. If your machine is hitting too hard or you are not working off the tip of those needles, boom, you've just placed way too much pigment in that area to create the soft shade that you want. But on the other hand, that is also why round shaders are so good, and a lot of colour guys tend to use them, because they pack in areas so quickly and easily and can also be used to tighten those edges. Having a softer hitting machine with give and the correct technique will aid in your mission to get a smoother blend with a round shader. For me, round shaders isn't just about the machine that you use and the needle size that you use, it's also about the voltage. When using a round shader, I also like to come down on my voltage 0.5 or even a full volt. And bringing those volts down slows your machine down, giving you more build-up time. So now you have given yourself like 3 to 4 chances to get it right. You have picked a more spread, more higher gauge needle. You have a softer machine, and now you have lowered your volts. You are working off the tip, that's 5. And when you have all these things working together, it becomes increasingly difficult to get it wrong. But if I'm running my machine at 7 volts, for round shaders, I'm bringing it down to 6.5 or even 6, depending on what I'm doing and the skin that I'm tattooing. Now obviously this will slow you down massively, but the more experience you get with using a round shader, the more things you can take away. Give, for example, when you get better at working from the tip of your needle and your technique gets that little bit cleaner, you may not want give. Take it away. Same with the softness of your machine. That is there to counteract this. But when you learn to use this, take it away. Now if I'm lining with a round shader, obviously I won't bring my volts down. In fact, I will keep my volts the same or go up, sometimes by 2 volts. But that is all dependent on the size of the round shader that I'm using. The bigger you go on round shader, the more power, the more force is needed to drive that needle. I do not recommend, however, that you go up by 2 volts. Voltage is such an individual thing to the person's hand and the machine that they are using. So increase your voltage slowly until you find what works for you, your hand, your machine, and the needle size that you are using. Now talking about technique, it does not differ from what you do with mags. You are still using the back and forth pendulum motion. If you don't know what pendulum technique is, it is basically pivoting on your finger, running back and forth, entering the skin at an angle and coming out at the angle, entering back in at that angle, coming back out at that angle. Doing this creates a softer blend on the entry and the exit, allowing you to achieve more smoother transitions between values, and that goes for color also. Now pendulum is the main technique that you will use, but don't be fooled, you will not use it all the time. Depending on what you are using the round shader for will require some technique adjustment, but if you have put in place all the things that we've talked about, no matter the technique, it will help. But contrary to what I have just said, sometimes bringing your voltage back up is sometimes required, depending on what you are doing and the area that you are tattooing. But finally, let's get on to the demonstration. So for the purpose of the demonstration, I've just lined in a little shoddy triangle, and I have a medium wash by Empire. Now I'm currently sitting at 7.5 volts, so what we're going to do is bring that down 0.5 to 7. And the needle I'm using is a 9 round shader, 10 gauge. So when we dip, we only want a small dip. We are trying to minimize the amount of puddling that we get. And then what we're going to start doing is just start working in that corner, going back and forth, pivoting on his little finger. You're going to do this all the way through. Now what you don't want to be doing is dragging too far. So just stick within the area. If you had a bigger area than this with a 9 round shader, you would definitely need maybe a 14 round shader or even a mag. But we're going to be pulling like this. We're going to be going back and forth like this. We're also going to be changing directions depending on what we obviously need for the piece. Just working from the tip of that needle. Alright, now we're slowly starting to build. And I don't know if it's picking up on camera, but it is looking pretty damn smooth. Now on real skin, obviously it won't take as long as this. Fake skin is a little bit different from real skin. It does take a little bit more build up time. But also just keep in mind that I am only using a medium tone here. Depending on the piece that I am doing would depend on the tone that I use also. So I'm currently just building up and building up until I'm happy. Just varying up direction, but always mainly staying to that pendulum motion. Working from the tip of my needle. If I want a sharp edge, I'm starting from the edge and pushing out. Same with the tips. If I want a sharp tip, starting from the tip, pushing down and pushing in from the corners. And then just filling in the rest. But it really is about, you know, how your machine's hitting, your technique, the needle that you're using. And if you get them all right, you end up with something like this.